All right. Well, with that, why don't we fire things up? My name is Rich Dandliker, and I'm the Chief Strategist at VEZA. And I come from the identity and security world. Most recently, I was at Okta, where I led the product management team for about 4.5 years through the IPO period. And now at VEZA, helping push forward around identity security. So in particular, one of the things that I think is really interesting and unique about VEZA is we sort of came in with a thesis that there was sort of a missing intelligence gap around identity. In particular, around answering the question, who can and should take what action on what data, or the problem of authorization, if you sort of are in that world. And we've built a metadata graph, a really pretty unique data construct to really start to underscore getting intelligence to that problem, to really be able to answer that question in cloud environments, often for the first time for a lot of people, who has access to what? And then how do you actually take action to make it better? How do you get to least privilege and really operationalize it, which is just a recurring challenge that we hear again and again. So I'll talk a little bit more about the problem. I'll talk a little bit more about sort of our perspective on industry solutions that are out there around identity, what we've actually created, and some of the things that enables. And I also want to take a little side tour down the road of the recent Microsoft breach, if you've been following that, because I think it's very relevant in some of the things that we're talking about. Give a little perspective of the future, and I hope we'll have time for Q&A. It's an hour-long session. I trust we will, but please interrupt me. The most valuable things I find is the feedback. So I may regret this depending how feisty you all get, but give me a question, raise your hand, and we'll try and actually answer those things like in the flow. All right. With that, I think everybody knows like security is not just the off in a closet anymore. It's now really becoming the CIO's job as well. And this is something where Gartner, I think, has done some actually pretty good research around this type of thing. The CIO and the IT team more broadly plays a very strong role in creating programs, creating metrics, creating tooling, operationalizing security. No surprise here, but it's relevant, broadly speaking. And if you dive a little bit deeper into security, we find that in the zero trust world, identity is often at the core, at the heart of a lot of the recent breaches. So depending on what data you believe and what publications you like to read, anywhere from 50 to 80% of breaches have some sort of identity component to it, or other publications actually will cite that 80% of companies have been breached using an identity-related compromise. Right? And so clearly that kind of thing, things like misused passwords, some sort of tokenization where people are getting access. They're not just coming in and hacking in; they're logging in. Right? That is now the new mantra, and that is just really become front and center, especially in a cloud environment where this stuff gets very, very complicated, more complicated than before, and hard to manage. And so now, when you look, to your tool set, so depending on where your organization is, how long you've been around, you may have, 1, 2, 3, all, maybe none of these, but the most classic examples of sort of tools in this area are the 3 big markets in identity. So within PAM, which has been around since 1999, so privileged access management, CyberArk, Delinea, those types of solutions. And those are there, and they're good for certain things like doing secrets management or to do session recording on a server with an agent. They're great for that, but they don't provide a lot of access and insight into non-privileged accounts. And in the cloud, privileged accounts and non-privileged accounts get very blurry, right? It's really hard to tell the difference. And so what do you do for all that other stuff? You're generally pretty blind, even with a solution like that. If you go into identity and access management, the Oktas of the world, the Microsoft Entra, Azure AD types of things. That's great for single sign-on, for federation, for multi-factor authentication, for anything signing in, anything authentication. Not so good on authorization. I got to say, when I was at Okta, and I got that question, what do you guys do for authorization? That was not the question I wanted to hear, because it wasn't much. All right. And so you're really blind to these things. It's good for users and groups, but getting down to permissions, getting down to really understanding what different users could do and how they got those permissions, that was not a question that these tools ever answered. You go into IGA, Identity Governance and Administration, the SailPoints of the world, the Savients of the world. You can do access reviews, you can do provisioning of accounts, but again, you're limited to users and groups, right? Or a role name. But what does that role do in AWS, in Snowflake? You're on your own, right? Very tough to see. When you go down to provisioning, it's the same kind of thing. And we'll see more that you run into these barriers where you're just forced to do things that end up, and this is what I typically hear from customers, things like access reviews. A compliance-driven process, often every manager in the company is involved. And when I ask people, like, well, how much does that really improve your security posture? It's not much, right? It's a compliance checkbox. It's something that has to be done because the auditors insist on it. Is it really doing good? Not that much. I was actually, one of my favorite stories, I was talking to a product manager that we're interviewing, who was the product manager for B of A. And he was actually running an internal tool for them. And I was asking him, he's like, hey, what was your biggest accomplishment during that time? And he says, well, you know, in the access review process, in addition to the approve, deny, I added a third button. I added the I don't know button. And he says he got his first year got fully 50% of clicks on the I don't know button. Because what do? You say, you know, Fred's a member of this group. Okay, Fred's a member of this group. What does that mean? I don't know what that means, right? Or worse yet, you get the raw permissions from that system, and it's some language you don't understand. You have to be an administrator of that system to really understand it, right? It's very hard to make intelligent, informed decisions for all of us in this room, let alone you have a manager in HR, you have a manager of finance that's making decisions about whether access is correct. What hope do they have of getting that answer right? You know what people are doing. They're just clicking, right? And is there something better we can do? And so that's sort of the context behind how we built the authorization graph. What is the authorization graph? It's really pulling together all this data from users that might come from your IAM system, from your Okta or your AD on-prem or your Azure AD Entra repository, linking them to groups, linking them to roles in all these different systems, but then not stopping there, but actually linking up these roles and saying, all right, well, what does this allow you to do in terms of CRUD, in terms of create, read, update, delete, down to resources in that system. And of course, every resource here is different, right? A repo in GitHub is not the same as an S3 bucket, is not the same as a table in Snowflake, right? But all the roles generally control these things. And so it's a graph because it's not just a flat list of who has access to what, but more importantly, what's the relationship between the two? If someone has access to, you know, again, I'll pick on poor Fred. Fred has access to that table of customer data, of your most critical customer data in Snowflake. How did he get it? Is it because he's a member of a group and everybody in that group gets it? Is it because he gets a role in Snowflake that allows that access? Does he have some sort of local user or ACL level permissions? Or does he have 10 different ways to get to that thing? And so if you actually want to think about shutting off Fred's access to that table, you've got to address each of those paths. You can't just say, well, this is wrong, but that's just the start of your problem, because now, how do you stop it? And are you creating then collateral damage? Or is it a matter of where there's smoke, there's fire? Hey, we just discovered something, Fred's in this group, everybody in that group has that. Holy moly, this is not just Fred, we just happened to catch Fred. Right? And so answering all these questions and figuring out not just where the problems are, but how do you fix them without creating bigger problems, that's where the power of the graph really comes into play. And then when you look at it in the context of what we were talking about before against PAM, right? Now you're not just talking about privileged identities as some separate thing, it's all identities, right? It's everything in there. Some may have some varying level of privilege, right? Some more presenting more risk than others. In terms of IAM, now we're not just stopping at the layer of logging in. Now we're actually seeing, hey, what can someone do once they're in? What is the authorization of this? And then from a perspective of IGA, you can do it across all types of identities, not just identities in your HR system. But now you think about, like, well, what about contractors, temporary workers, people who are maybe not quite outside the HR system because your HR department doesn't want to take those into the HR system? Or service accounts, machine identities. Definitely not in the HR system, right? And so you can also think about, on the other side, going down to the level of working in an IGA governance type of process with things that are not just users and groups. What if you want to do access reviews on an S3 bucket in AWS? You can't do that in identity governance, right? Strictly defined, it's just users and groups. Do you have access to this? Yes, no. All right. And so that's actually why some of our customers have bought, for that exact reason, that exact use case. Right. So this is sort of really, we see fulfilling and filling a missing part of the puzzle in identity security around answering this question. And so if you take another step, say, okay, if I have this data and I have these relationships and I have this graph, who cares? Who's going to use it? Where we typically see is it might be the IAM team, it might be the security engineering team, it might be security operations. And it really spans the gamut, right? Of when you want to get this level of insight, it might be around privileged access monitoring, like CrowdStrike is one of our customers. For them, it was Salesforce. They really wanted to see, hey, when is there a new administrator created in Salesforce? And you would think that sounds really easy. And the truth is, it's not. And there are many, many hidden backdoors to how you can get that access. And they actually had a legacy IGA product that was managing and provisioning access to Salesforce. They still couldn't tell. Right, so that's why they bought us. It might be around cloud platforms. As I mentioned, those are tricky. Right? You're looking at what a role really gets you in AWS and navigating through AWS IAM. I do this periodically. I'll go and download the user guide in PDF form. I think it's up to 2,200 pages for the user guide of just AWS IAM. And Azure RBAC is typically worse. Right? It's typically longer. And now multiply that across every other system. I went into GitHub and I was poking around, and I think there were like 83 different line items. When you look at a role of what GitHub does, 83 different line items of the specific permissions, this big, massive matrix of like, do you have that or do you not have that permission, right? Now multiply that across every application you've got in your environment, every data storage system. How could you possibly manage? How could you know without having some sort of tooling around it? Next gen IGA, customers like Intuit, doing access reviews. Right? Because now you're not just saying, is Fred part of this group? But holy moly, Fred has access to blow away my customer database. That's not right. Now you can actually make sort of informed decisions about these things, get a lot more insight into what these roles mean, not just having a role name or a role description, because God knows the role descriptions, if you've got them, you're lucky. If you've got them, they're probably wrong, right? How old are they? Is anyone keeping those up? No. You know the answer to that. And one of the emerging use cases here, non-human identity management, right? Really looking at things like service accounts, at machine identities, right? And that's what companies like Capital One are starting to do, where you have all those governance processes that you do on people. You have managers that go through and review everybody who's reporting to them. Same kind of thing on service accounts. Why would you do anything different? And arguably, it's more important. And we'll see that as we go into the Microsoft breach and sort of where attackers are starting to see the gaps in some of the tooling and the intelligence and the visibility, and really taking advantage of that. Okay, so that is one I want to dive into a little bit. So for those of you who've been following or not following, or at some level, this was announced back in January. So to Microsoft's credit, they did a nice job, I think, putting out information pretty quickly about this breach. But there's a lot to be desired from what actually went down. But I will not join the crowd and throw more stones at Microsoft. I actually appreciate the fact that they've given us a lot of information. So the short answer of what happened is Midnight Blizzard, Nobelium, Russian intelligence-related hacking group got access to all of Microsoft's corporate email. That's a short answer, right? And so why has this sort of been, I think, a different level of breach, incident, attack than others that we see and hear about every day, every week? One was Microsoft, because I don't know about you, but everybody I know trusts some portion of their security to Microsoft in some way, shape, or form. It's relevant. And they got the crown jewels. I don't know what you consider the crown jewels, but all corporate email is pretty darn close. because that's exactly what the attackers were going for. And last Friday, they announced this. So this all kind of came out in February. Last Friday, they also announced that, oh, by the way, in the corporate email, there were some secrets that were emailed around. This is going to be the gift that keeps on giving for a long, long time, right? And source code repositories were accessible through these secrets, and internal systems were accessible through this, and there were some customer to corporate communications that were involved. I'm like, oh, I mean, you imagine what's in your email system. It's a lot of stuff. The hackers are high profile. They have, so they were the SolarWinds folks, right? So they're, this is a recurring theme here. And I think from a technical perspective, the way that they went in is interesting and frightening. It's through compromised OAuth applications, right? And so we'll go into a little bit more about how that was. But so we'll start to see this theme that we were talking about before around service account security, service accounts governance, really being able to understand not just what people can do, but what service accounts and machine identities can do as a critical piece of being able to get to least privilege, manage the blast rate, the potential blast radius of an event that comes. And it's not not a question of if, but it's the question of when. When the attack comes, what's the blast radius going to be? And so, as they came in, they did a password spray. It was a sophisticated password spray against a legacy test tenant for Microsoft. And unfortunately, that account did not have MFA on it. It was a test tenant, so maybe that's, you can see how that might have happened. But they did a pretty sophisticated password spray because they used a residential proxy network to make sure that, any IP tracking, they weren't getting too many attempts, and they were below whatever thresholds there were around making sure that, to do normal attack detection. So they were doing strong work, and they got in, right? So they managed to find that password. Worse is once they were in that, they were able to find a legacy OAuth application, compromise that application. That application also had access to Microsoft's full corporate environment. Right? That's one to put a mark on, right? It was a test tenant, but there was stuff in there that had access. Basically the lateral movement was fully built in. Then they were able to go in the corporate environment. They were able to create a new user that then went through the OAuth consent flow. And what they're able to get for that legacy OAuth application, and they created a bunch of other applications, presumably to sort of obfuscate some of the things. And so, it started to look like normal behavior because there were lots of apps doing it. And they got these permissions here. Actually, these are roughly equivalent. There are two different permissions, either in the Microsoft Graph or in O365. EWS access as user.all, full access as app, but essentially being able to get access to every mailbox as that user of that mailbox, right? So this is a special application level permission, one permission, all right? That was it. So you'll hear some of these themes, right, of like what happened and how this went down and what were really the important pivot points. But from my perspective, I think there were sort of 5 things to take away from this. The first, pretty basic stuff, but there was excess privilege here going on, right? That was core to this breach of how they got in. It was that legacy OAuth application that was in a test tenant that also had access to the corporate environment. I'm guessing there was not a good reason for it, and that was a miss. The second is this lack of visibility. I think if Microsoft had known that OAuth application in the test tenant had access to corporate, they probably would have taken action. Probably. I bet they didn't know. All right, so that lack of visibility of machine identity, who can take what action on what data, they did not have that visibility. The third point is that every application and system has its own language. I don't know about you guys, but those permissions of EWS.access as user.all, I'd never heard of that permission before, right? I'm guessing only your Exchange admin. Maybe if you have a Microsoft Graph guru, they've heard of that. For the rest of us, what does that mean? Does that mean keys to the kingdom? You gotta be an expert to know. It is not obvious, right? I'm guessing there are a few more of those out there. Another good example here, The MGM breach, where their casinos came down, that was Okta, right? And there, similar story, because the critical permission there was a feature called inbound federation, where you essentially could say, hey, I want to go link to another external IDP, and I'm going to trust that IDP. So I'm going to create my own user base somewhere else. It's one little feature. It's one little permission that any custom admin can have. It doesn't have to be a super admin in Okta. Any admin can get that single permission. You can create a custom role for level 1 help desk role, can have that permission, right? That was the key to that one. If you're not an Okta person, do you know what that feature, do you understand the implications of that inbound federation checkbox permission is? I would argue not. It's not intuitively obvious. The fourth point is trying to manage just with roles, really tough. Because again, these are granular permissions. These are not special roles because they get to be associated with lots of different roles potentially. You can make up custom roles that have these things. It's not just the super secret admin, right? That's really critical. And understanding what's in the role is absolutely, absolutely critical. And the last thing, just machine identities, right? Service accounts, service principals. That, I'm not going on too much of a limb here. That's going to be the big battleground, right, of things going forward. That is a huge, huge surface area of risk, and that's going to be a big, big push, I'd say, in the next couple of years. All right. So when you look over to see about an authorization graph, again, I've talked about a few of these things, but having coverage for that, not just in human identities, but the service accounts, absolutely critical, important. Getting these permissions visible in that graph, not just groups and roles, but really understanding what the granular level permissions are, that's a critical piece of it. And then the last piece is now you can also think about more granular, more holistically, and you think about like all your other security, parts of your security ecosystem. Like, wouldn't it be nice to have some sort of quantification of risk in terms of permissions? Because generally speaking, when I see, like if you're trying to go through and figure out which endpoints to go fix off your long, long list, you're going to go for the admins first, right? You're going to go for the privileged accounts. But admin is not black and white, right? There are all sorts of levels of admin, and there are all sorts of different systems of different criticalities. Would it be nice to have a way to sort of say, hey, how do I prioritize? How do I risk prioritize based on the potential blast radius, based on how much someone has access to take action on all the other things? Because we all know every security tool is throwing off a tremendous number of alerts, and you've got to prioritize. You cannot just say, do them all. That never works, right? So how do you figure out what are the ones that are most important? This provides a really nice risk-based quantification of what that means in terms of the amount and potential impact of the privilege that someone has, identity has. All right. So that was Microsoft. Now let's maybe look forward a little bit, have some fun, think about where this can go. We often like to think about the idea of intelligent access as being the vision of where this is headed. Right? And what does intelligent access mean? It means coverage for all systems. Right? This means not just doing it for databases and then a separate system for data lakes and a separate system for SaaS apps. This means everything. Your structured data systems, your unstructured data systems, your SaaS apps, your on-premise apps, your cloud platforms like AWS and Azure and Google Cloud, and your custom applications that you built in-house. All those things, right? Not just a subsegment of them. All identities, we've talked about that. HR system identities. Everybody who's human, who's not in the HR system, like contractors, maybe, depending on what your organization does. But then also the machine identities, the service accounts, the service principals. Having coverage across all those types of identities. Getting to true permissions. And this means that really getting down to the granular level, not just doing it at the role level. Because the role level doesn't really tell you what you need to know in most cases. Because I hear this from customers all the time. I have a read-only role, and guess what? There's write privileges in there. All the time, right? Because who's really keeping those things up? Is anybody auditing those? How well are they auditing those things? Not that well. Democratized. This is the idea of having the translational layer, of being able to, enable the manager in HR to understand the decision that he or she is going to make about access for their team. All right? Is this appropriate? Are these things necessary for them to do their job? Down to a level that actually helps them understand what it means. And then automation, right? We don't have time. None of us have time to actually go through and manually do this. So how can we start to leverage things like, hey, we have some policies we can automatically enforce. We don't need to go look at a console. We don't need to go tell someone at the IT help desk, don't provision these types of people to this stuff. That's bad. Right? Actually have a system that's watching over it, have a system that's automatically enforcing these things. And so you need a way to build that policy, but then also have visibility to that in real time, near real time, to actually see what's going on. Right? And then leveraging in things like activity. Is someone actually using the permissions that they have? If they're not, maybe that should get taken away. Right? They don't need it to do their job, as demonstrated by their not using it. Right? This is also another one I like, is this idea of the access lifecycle, right? And we hear a lot about life cycles and identity life cycles, but specifically think about access. Like, how do you get access? How does access get taken away? Right? And I really think about it in these sort of four processes. Typically, what I see at customers and organizations. First is around birthright provisioning. The joiner, mover, leaver types of scenarios. You might have an automated system that does this. You might not. But something that's driven by a change in your employment status, either your department, or are you active or not? Have you been terminated or not? And you'll get access, and access will be taken away according to that process. Request-driven provisioning. Hey, not on day 1, but on day 32, I find I need access to something that I don't have. I need to do my job. So I'm going to go typically submit a ticket to the help desk and say, hey, I need access to this. We hear a lot of this. An interesting one as well is, what do you grant access to? This is just back to a tricky one, but this reminds me of one of our customers who's doing this for Snowflake. They have developers that are asking for some resource in Snowflake, a table in Snowflake. They say, hey, I need to get access to the table in Snowflake. And the question that they came to us with is like, hey, how do I know what role to grant them in Snowflake? Because I don't want to break my role structure, but I can't tell what's the best role. And so in that case, they were using the authorization graph for this simple purpose of saying, hey, if they need to get the access to that table, what role can I grant them that best conforms to least privilege? That gives them that table, but as little else as possible. And just by implementing that process to request-driven provisioning for them, they were able to reduce the total number of permissions on Snowflake by 80%. So what that translates to me is like, when push comes to shove and a developer needs to get something done, they get broad access because you just want to make sure they get the access and they're not blocked and you could continue to accelerate. And it's very rare that ever gets taken away. That's very, very normal. There's also shadow provisioning, right? This is all the stuff that shouldn't ever happen that happens, right? This is local user accounts, typically. Or it can also be, the guy who's been around for 20 years and the process has only been around for 12. All that stuff that they accumulated in those 8 years and never got ripped away. That's another, I think, a recurring theme about access. The person who's been around the longest has the most access, right? That is a truism. And then there's access removal, and this takes different forms. Sometimes it's security engineering team that's going around and hunting these things down. Sometimes it's the outcome of rejection in the access review process, but somehow there's often some ways that people get access taken away that's outside of just deprovisioning on termination of employment. And then you think about all these things going together, but now you think about all these things as well. Like typically, these are disjointed processes. Most of the time when I see these are not well connected together. In other words, when someone gets access taken away, going back and saying, hey, how did they get access in the first place? How did that go down? Is there something else we need to fix, farther upstream? Or these guardrails? When I hear this from CISOs all the time, like, hey, I have some data over here, and it's, maybe I have users in China. I don't want those two things to ever cross, right? These China people cannot get data from my other customers over here. How do I enforce that across every system that I have, right? But not besides just telling the IT help desk not to provision them, right? So you can think about all these tricks, and imagine the next data privacy regulation that comes down, right? Now I need to somehow enforce consistently across all my different repositories of data some change in policy. How do I take this paper policy, or worse yet, a regulation legalese, and translate that into technical controls on all these different systems and make sure I'm getting what I thought I got? It's very hard, right? And so starting to unify this on a common platform, this is why when you think about having connections to all systems, it starts to become really powerful, because now you can actually use this as the Rosetta Stone, the Star Trek Universal Translator for access. What does this mean? I have plain language, but I don't understand what knobs and policies and checkboxes to tweak to get that done, to make that happen. Of course, AI, right? There's always going to be some AI. And I think just, in terms of this, we're taking a very broad approach. Just from a methodology perspective, I think it's very much more about, it's not AI for AI's sake, it's for what AI can possibly do, right? So it's going to, really going to be some broad testing and validation that this is actually an effective approach. My favorite story out of the news was, if anybody heard about the Air Canada incident, they had a large language model driven chatbot. And someone was interacting with it, asking questions about fares and bereavement fares, and the chatbot told them, oh yeah, if you can, just submit your ticket later, you can get a bereavement fare post facto. It turned out to be not the policy, that you have to request the bereavement fare right up in front. It actually went to a lawsuit. And Air Canada was trying to say, we're not responsible for what our chatbot told them. I couldn't believe it. They lost that case, amazingly enough. But if you had any doubt, that underscores this, that when you look at the answers from the LLMs of they tell you something that sounds plausible but may not be right. That may not be something you want to implement everywhere. Yeah. And then they took the chatbot offline. See, that they learned. They took the chatbot offline. That's right. And so I think there is going to be a bit of a backlash, or there's going to be a reassessment. I mean, this, obviously LLMs, immensely powerful, do some amazing things, but it's not good for everything. It's not the right tool for everything. And there's still some very more basic things like, unsupervised learning, cluster analysis for things like role mining. Very, very obvious good application for that. Thinking about how do I prioritize and look for outliers when I'm doing my access reviews. Show me the stuff that looks the weirdest up at the top, right? The things that, if there's something that matches a birthright policy and I've clicked yes to the last 4 quarters, you can put that at the bottom, right? That might even be a, select all approve kind of thing. But the thing that, where someone has access and he or she is the only one who has that access, that should be up at the top, right? Simple stuff like that. But then you can also advance forward to some ideas around federated learning, around being able to segment customers by size and industry vertical, and say, hey, what does normal access permissions look like? Are you sort of there benchmarked with your peers? Obviously, there are always going to be some things that are particular to your environment that are different, but there might also be some interesting things. And again, depending how broad the data is that we can put together and put to bear here. And then natural language processing, doing search and things like that, so you don't actually have to structure it. You can do things that are much more friendly to business users in natural language. All right. And so the long-term vision of sort of where we see this going, it seems pretty straightforward. If you've been around security, you've seen something like this across probably any number of industries. But starting with visualization, starting with intelligence, starting with the knowledge of who does have access to what, understanding the environment as it stands today. That is absolutely the starting place. And if you look around at a lot of products, that's not always the starting place. Many times, many products start with number 3. right? I just want to control it, right? And how on earth do you know what to control and what to do? How do you understand what the ramifications of those policies? What are the right policies? Very, very hard. But starting with understanding the current environment, then going to, hey, now are there things that I start to see that are wrong? Can I start to fix some things? Because I see something, oh, and my gosh, that's not right. Let me go change that. Then once you started to do that, getting to that nirvana of control. And that's really where you think about my loaded question that we help answer, who can and should take what action on what data. It's the should part that's actually really nasty. That's the policy part, right? And you think about where your policy is for all this stuff. It's all over the place, if anywhere, right? There are tidbits of it and snippets of it. You know, thou shalt not do this over here. You know, you probably have some separation of duties somewhere where there's some things over here, but how do you sort of take that in a comprehensive way and understand the net effect of that? You know, then in the end, should Fred have access to this table and have delete access to this table? Is that then right? Right. That and putting all that stuff together is really, really hard. But that is the vision, right? To where you can actually do that. Then you can start to automate it. Then you can start to say, hey, and I know what the policy is, or at least I know, you know, and it's going to be a journey. Right, you're never going to, be done. You're never going to be done with policy. You're going to get to a certain point. But can you start with even just one simple statement like, "Hey, no one in China can get access for, my customers who are of the federal government in the U.S." That's a good rule to start with, and then build from there, right? And then, but figuring out all those layers and allow that flexibility to grow, to mature, to go down that journey and enforce it. Have automation against it so that you're not trying to spend huge amounts of people's time and resources and energy doing this manually. So very quickly, a little bit about VEZA and who we are. We're a startup. We're founded in 2020. We did public launch in 2022. About 125 employees now. Customers like Wind Resorts, Intuit, Blackstone, Capital One, Mattel, Rakuten, Snowflake. Snowflake is actually using us to protect the largest instance of Snowflake in the world, which is Snowflake, Snowflake internal, which was that's a great one for us. So both across sort of global 1000s, but also down to mid-market, 500 to 3,000 employees. Typically, people who have data they want to protect, which obviously spans a lot of different types of organizations. And with that, any questions, thoughts, reflections? How are we doing on time here? Great. Any questions? Yes? The question is, how do we map to the actual resources? So we'll have integrations. And right now we have about 200 integrations into these target systems. Depending on what the target system supports in terms of APIs, obviously for cloud SaaS applications, they generally have pretty good APIs that will enumerate those resources back. In other cases, we've done integrations to AS400 on-prem things. Those are a little brutal. And of course, it always depends on, and the length of time and the amount of effort to build those integrations depends how deep you go into the authorization structure, right? But typically speaking, we'll go down to somewhere we can do some enumeration of the resources, but that goes integration by integration, which is one of the challenges for this type of thing, because you do have to go and interrogate those systems and get that enumeration of resources, which are different system by system, but that is what we do. That's right. And so typically, the question was about custom applications. Typically, that's done deeply in partnership with the customer. So obviously, we don't know what your custom applications do, but customers like Blackstone is a good example. They're a heavy user of integrating to their own custom applications. Within about the first 4 months, they were able to onboard about 60 different custom applications into the system, but they're actually on a journey for scaling it up significantly because they have hundreds in their environment. All right. Yes? So it depends on the deployment. So we're typically SaaS-based. So we have a public cloud, and that's how most customers deploy. However, we are also able to deploy, and a few customers have deployed us within a VPC, a virtual private cloud. So you can, for for extreme, high assurance customers, we do deploy in a VPC environment. Most customers do the public cloud. So so in most cases, yes, we get the authorization metadata, not the core data itself, so not the customer records, but the data about those records, resources, permissions, who has access to that. Yep. Any other questions? Yeah.
So I know you were talking about Microsoft before being hackers earlier this year. Do you have any additional, or do you have any securities that would ensure that, let's say, a hacker were to infiltrate a network and look for a product called VEZA, knowing that it has some kind of central access of these user tables and security tables, and there's securities enabled that would find and detect and make sure that people can't get in and get the single source of information?
Yep, that's a great point. Is that, and the context was around, hey, how do you protect VEZA, because it is, in theory, it's an attack map of some sort, right? Where that's a really valuable resource. That is something that we pay a lot of attention to in terms of enabling, the basics, like making sure you have MFA, making sure we're going through, ISO 20002. We actually just hired Chief Trust and Security Officer Mike Towers, who has been around the CISO community for a long time. So definitely, security is very top of mind, because that we do hold that trust very, very dearly, because we expect to have intrusion attempts.